The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning in March 2019, the kind of dense, humid crowd that made the air feel thick and charged with anticipation. Judge Marcus Harrington sat behind his bench with the kind of posture that suggested he'd already decided how this day would unfold, his black robes pristine, his expression carved from granite. He was known throughout the county as a hard man, someone who didn't suffer fools, didn't tolerate excuses, and certainly didn't waste time on sentiment. 53 years old, with silver hair combed back in perfect lines, Harrington had built his reputation on efficiency and what he called justice, but what others whispered was something closer to cruelty. The case before him seemed routine enough on paper, just another property dispute in a long line of property disputes, but the man standing in the defendant's position made it anything but ordinary. James Mitchell stood there, in his dress uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed and clean, ribbons arranged in perfect rows across his chest. 72 years old, with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the lingering effects of injuries sustained decades ago, in jungles, half a world away. Mitchell held himself with the dignity of someone who had faced far worse than an irritated judge. His lawyer, a young woman named Sarah Chen, fresh out of law school and working pro bono cases, shuffled papers nervously beside him. The case itself was straightforward but devastating. Mitchell had fallen behind on property taxes for his small home, a modest two-bedroom house on Elm Street where he'd lived for 40 years, raised his children, buried his wife. Medical bills had piled up after a surgery to remove shrapnel that had finally worked its way to a dangerous position near his spine, bills that insurance only partially covered, and in the chaos of recovery he'd missed payments. The county had moved swiftly, as counties do, and now Mitchell faced eviction and the sale of his home to cover the debt. He'd come to court hoping for an extension, maybe a payment plan, anything that would let him keep the only thing he had left that connected him to his family and his past. But Judge Harrington had other ideas, and as he looked down at the papers before him with barely concealed impatience, the tension in the room grew thick enough to taste. Judge Harrington shuffled the papers on his desk with deliberate slowness, letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable for everyone in the gallery. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of bored authority that suggested he'd already made up his mind before the hearing even began. "Mr. Mitchell, I see here you're requesting a 6-month extension on your property tax debt in a structured payment plan." He didn't look up from the documents, didn't meet Mitchell's eyes, just continued reading in that flat, disinterested tone. "You're claiming financial hardship due to medical expenses. Is that correct?" Mitchell straightened his shoulders, an automatic response drilled into him by years of military discipline. "Yes, Your Honor. I had surgery last year, and the recovery was longer than expected. I fell behind, but I'm ready to make payments now. I just need some time to get back on my feet." Harrington finally looked up, and his eyes swept over Mitchell with the kind of assessment that felt clinical and cold. They lingered for a moment on the medals pinned to Mitchell's chest, the Purple Heart prominent among them, the bronze star catching the fluorescent light. Something shifted in the judge's expression, something that looked uncomfortably close to contempt. "I see you've dressed up for court today," Harrington said, and there was an edge to his voice now, something sharp and cutting. "Quite the display of medals you have there. Very impressive." The sarcasm in his tone made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Chen placed a warning hand on Mitchell's arm, sensing the direction this was heading, but the veteran remained still, his face carefully neutral. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I wore my uniform because this is an important occasion. I wanted to show the court that I take this matter seriously." Harrington leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Oh, I'm sure you do take it seriously, Mr. Mitchell. What I'm not sure about is why you think your service record is relevant to your inability to pay your taxes on time. This is a court of law, not a military parade ground. Your medals don't change the fact that you owe this county $17,000 in back taxes and penalties." The words hung in the air like a slap, and Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah Chen stood quickly, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell's service record demonstrates a lifetime of responsibility and commitment to duty. He's asking for a reasonable accommodation to address a temporary financial setback caused by legitimate medical expenses directly related to injuries sustained in combat. The county has discretion to grant extensions in cases of genuine hardship, and this clearly qualifies. Harrington's smile widened, but it was the smile of a predator who's just spotted weakness. Miss Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let me explain something to you since you're new to this court. I see dozens of cases like this every month. Everyone has a story. Everyone has an excuse. Medical bills, job loss, family emergencies, you name it. I've heard it. And if I granted extensions to everyone who came in here with a sob story and a good reason, this county would collapse under the weight of unpaid taxes. He turned his attention back to Mitchell, and his voice took on a mocking quality that made the veteran's hands curl into fists at his sides. I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but your medals don't pay bills. Your service, while I'm sure was very meaningful to you, doesn't entitle you to special treatment under the law. You're a citizen like everyone else, and citizens pay their taxes. If you can't meet your financial obligations, then you shouldn't be living in a house you can't afford. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations, and Mitchell felt heat rising in his chest, not anger exactly, but something closer to disbelief. He'd faced enemy fire, had pulled wounded men through rice paddies, under mortar bombardment, had done things and seen things that still woke him up at night, 40 years later, and now this man in his comfortable chair was telling him that none of it mattered, because he'd fallen on hard times. Sarah Chen tried again, her voice rising slightly. Your Honor, with all due respect, Mr. Mitchell served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in action, and the Bronze Star for valor. He's never asked for special treatment before, and he's not asking for it now. He's simply asking for the same consideration any taxpayer would receive when facing genuine hardship. Harrington leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Let me be very clear, Counselor. I don't care if Mitchell has a chest full of medals, or a closet full of commendations. What I care about is the law, and the law says he owes money he hasn't paid. Now, unless you have something substantive to add to these proceedings, I suggest we move forward with the judgment. Mitchell felt something break inside him at those words. Not his composure exactly, but something deeper, some fundamental belief that service meant something, that sacrifice counted for something in the country he'd bled for. He'd been quiet until now, letting his lawyer speak for him, but the judge's dismissive tone and that mocking smile pushed him past the point of silence. Your Honor, may I speak? His voice was steady, the voice of a man who'd given orders under fire and wasn't afraid of authority. Harrington waved a hand dismissively. By all means, Mr. Mitchell, tell me why I should care about your military service when we're discussing your failure to pay property taxes. Mitchell took a breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking you to care about my service, Your Honor. I'm not even asking for special treatment. I'm just asking for what the law allows, which is consideration for genuine hardship. I've paid taxes on that house for 40 years without missing a payment until last year. I raised 3 children there. My wife died there. It's all I have left, and I'm asking for a chance to make this right. Just 6 months to get back on my feet. That's all I need. For a moment, something flickered in Harrington's expression, something that might have been understanding or sympathy, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Mr. Mitchell, your personal attachments to the property are not relevant to this court. Thousands of people have emotional connections to homes they lose every year. That's unfortunate, but it's not a legal argument. Your request for an extension is denied. The property will be sold at auction to satisfy the debt, and you have 30 days to vacate the premises. This court is. That's when the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, the heavy oak panels swinging wide with enough force to bang against the wall. Every head in the room turned, conversations dying mid-sentence, and Judge Harrington's gavel froze halfway to the bench. The man who walked in was impossible to ignore, not just because of his height, easily 6'3", or his bearing, which carried decades of command authority, but because of the uniform he wore. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders, the rank of a full general, and his chest bore rows of ribbons that spoke of conflicts spanning multiple decades. His hair was white, but still cut in military style, his face weathered, but strong, and his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, swept the courtroom with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. Behind him came two younger officers, both colonels by their insignia, their faces carefully neutral but their presence adding weight to the moment. The general stopped in the center aisle, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor with military precision, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Harrington recovered first, his face flushing red as he straightened in his seat. "This is a closed hearing. I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing here, but you need to leave immediately." "Bailiff." The general's voice cut through the judge's words like a blade through silk, quiet but absolutely commanding. "General Robert Cartwright, United States Army, retired. And I'm not going anywhere, Your Honor. I'm here as a character witness for Mr. James Mitchell." Harrington's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his carefully maintained composure cracking visibly. "This hearing is not accepting character witnesses. The matter before the court is a simple tax delinquency case, and it doesn't require testimony about the defendant's character. Now, general or not, you need to exit this courtroom before I hold you in contempt." General Cartwright didn't move an inch, didn't even blink, just stood there with the kind of immovable presence that comes from leading men in combat. "Judge Harrington, I watched you from the hallway for the last 10 minutes. I heard you mock this man's service. I heard you tell him his medals don't matter, and his sacrifice means nothing. I heard you laugh at a decorated veteran who's asking for basic human dignity." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees, and Harrington's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. "I didn't laugh, I was simply explaining the law." "You laughed," Cartwright interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now, something forged in fire and battle. "Maybe not out loud, but your tone, your words, your attitude, it was all laughter. Mocking laughter at a man who earned those medals in blood and pain while serving the country you're supposed to represent from that bench." Mitchell stood frozen at the defendant's table, his eyes locked on the general, recognition slowly dawning in his expression. Sarah Chen had gone completely still, her pen forgotten in her hand, watching this scene unfold like something from a movie. Harrington tried to regain control, his voice rising. "General Cartwright, I respect your service and your rank, but you have no authority in this courtroom. I am the presiding judge, and I will not be lectured on how to conduct my hearings. Now, for the last time, leave before I have you removed." Cartwright took 3 steps forward, close enough now that his voice could drop back to conversational level, but still carry to every corner of the room. "You want to know who James Mitchell is, Judge? You want to know what those medals mean? I'll tell you, because I was there." The courtroom had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that feels dense and heavy, where even breathing seems too loud. General Cartwright's eyes never left the judge's face, but his words painted pictures that everyone in the room could see. "May 17, 1968, Firebase, Phoenix, Quang Tri Province. We were a company of 140 men holding a position against a regiment of North Vietnamese regulars, at least 800 troops with artillery support. We were cut off, supplies running low, medevac helicopters couldn't land because of the fire. Command was ready to write us off as lost. Sergeant James Mitchell, 22 years old, was running supplies and ammunition to the forward positions while enemy mortars rained down around him. He made 17 trips across open ground under direct fire. 17 times he risked his life to keep his brothers armed and fighting." Cartwright paused, and for the first time since entering, emotion cracked through his controlled exterior. "I was a captain then, freshly arrived in country, scared out of my mind but trying not to show it. On Mitchell's 18th trip, he took shrapnel in his back and leg from a mortar that landed 15 feet away. It knocked him down, tore him up, should have killed him, but he got back up, grabbed the ammunition he'd dropped, and kept moving because there were men counting on him. That's what the Purple Heart on his chest represents, Judge. That's the medal you laughed at." Harrington had gone completely still, his face ashen, but Cartwright wasn't finished. "The bronze star he's wearing, that came 3 days later when we were finally mounting a counterattack to break the siege. Mitchell, still injured, still in pain, volunteered to lead a squad through enemy-held territory to knock out a machine gun nest that had us pinned down. He crawled through mud and blood for 200 meters, took out the position, and held it long enough for the rest of us to advance. He saved 37 lives that day. 37 men got to go home to their families because Sergeant Mitchell did his job when everything in him must have been screaming to just stay down and stay safe. The general's voice hardened again, taking on the tone of command. That man standing at your defendant's table isn't just some name on a docket, Your Honor. He's a hero in the truest sense of the word. He gave pieces of himself, literal pieces of his body and soul, so that people like you and me could sit in comfortable rooms and argue about property taxes. And you have the audacity to tell him his service doesn't matter, to mock him for wearing the medals he earned in hell. Mitchell had tears running down his face now, though he stood straight and still, decades of discipline keeping him at attention. Sarah Chen had abandoned any pretense of professional detachment and was openly wiping her eyes. Half the gallery was in tears, and several veterans in the crowd had stood at some point during Cartwright's speech, their own medals visible on jackets and shirts. Judge Harrington seemed to be struggling for words, his earlier arrogance completely deflated, replaced by something that looked like shame and confusion. General, I didn't know. The case file didn't detail. The case file. Cartwright's voice rose for the first time, anger finally breaking through his control. You didn't need a case file to treat this man with basic human respect. You didn't need a detailed service record to understand that someone wearing those medals had sacrificed for this country. All you needed was common decency, something you apparently left outside this courtroom when you put on that robe. He turned slightly, addressing the entire room now, but his words were still aimed at the judge. I've spent 40 years in the military. I've commanded men in 3 wars and more conflicts than I can count. I've seen the best humanity has to offer, and the worst. And one thing I learned early and never forgot is that how you treat people when they're vulnerable, when they're down, when they need help, that's the measure of your character, not your title, not your position, not the power you wield over others. Your character. Cartwright turned back to Harrington and his voice dropped to something quieter but no less intense. I came to this courthouse today because James Mitchell called me last night. We've stayed in touch over the years, birthday cards and phone calls, the way brothers do. He told me about this hearing, about falling behind on his taxes because of medical bills, about the surgery to remove shrapnel that's been working its way through his body for 50 years. Shrapnel he took defending this country. He didn't ask me to come here, didn't want to impose or make a fuss. That's who he is. But I came anyway because I knew he needed someone in his corner, and because I owe him my life along with 36 other men. The general pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper that he placed carefully on the judge's bench. That's a check for $17,000, made out to the county. It covers Mr. Mitchell's full tax debt, plus penalties. Consider his account settled. He won't be taking your extension, and he won't be making payment plans. His debt is paid in full, right now. Harrington stared at the check like it was a live grenade, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for it. General, this is incredibly generous, but you don't have to. I know I don't have to, Cartwright interrupted. I want because James Mitchell is worth it, because his service meant something, because his sacrifice deserves recognition, all the things you couldn't see from up there on your high bench. The judge sat in silence for a long moment, the check in his hands, his face a portrait of shame and regret. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by something that sounded genuinely broken. Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology, a profound apology. My behavior today was inexcusable. I let the pressures of this job, the volume of cases, the repetition of hardship stories, I let all of that turn me into something I never wanted to be. Someone who forgot that every case represents a real person with a real life and real struggles. He stood up, something judges rarely do during proceedings, and looked directly at Mitchell for the first time with actual recognition in his eyes. Your service does matter. Your sacrifice matters. You matter. And I'm sorry it took General Cartwright walking through those doors for me to remember that. This case is dismissed. Your home is yours. And for whatever it's worth, thank you for your service. Mitchell nodded slowly, not trusting his voice, and General Cartwright placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture speaking volumes that words couldn't capture. Sarah Chen was gathering her papers with shaking hands, still processing what had just happened, while the gallery erupted in applause that the bailiff made no attempt to quiet. As Mitchell and Cartwright walked out of the courtroom together, two old soldiers side by side, the general spoke quietly. That house is yours free and clear, brother, but more than that, your dignity is intact. Don't let anyone ever make you feel small for what you've done or who you are. They stepped out into the bright sunshine of that March morning, and Mitchell took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in months. The weight of fear and uncertainty had lifted, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten, the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that his service had forged bonds stronger than time or distance. Behind them, Judge Harrington remained at his bench long after the courtroom cleared, staring at that check, and wondering when exactly he'd lost sight of the human beings behind the case numbers. It was a lesson that would change how he approached every hearing for the rest of his career, a reminder that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. The story spread through the veteran community like wildfire, not as a tale of special treatment or privilege, but as a reminder that sacrifice creates bonds that endure, that the men and women who serve never really stop watching out for each other. Mitchell would live in that house for another decade, and when he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, General Cartwright was one of the pallbearers at his funeral, still honoring the man who'd saved his life in a jungle half a century earlier.